Okay, afternoon everybody. So this is the sharing economy, radical capitalism or high-tech pocket money. I just want to firstly give thanks to session partner Tata Consultancy, and it's also been produced in association with Big Potatoes and City AM as well. So for me, very, very briefly, this session is an interesting one, and it's about perhaps if the sharing economy is about genuine disruption, or if it's a sign of stagnation in the real economy, or even if it's whether it's an indication that sharing is a new caring, and it's the embodiment of living a life sharing between ourselves and perhaps points to a more sustainable way of living, or even is sharing and the sharing economy also about learning to trust each other again, perhaps, and being nice to each other. So is sharing economy as much about economics as well as about being nice to each other? So what I'm going to do is just briefly introduce the speakers, and then they will kick off with their introductions of 5 to 7 minutes. I'm probably just going to ask them one question as the panel, and we'll discuss and have a chat, debate for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to open it out to yourselves for the remaining 40 or so minutes. So the speakers, I would encourage you to go online as well to check out their bios, but in order of speaking, first of all I have Benita Matsofka, who's Chief Sharer, Compare and Share, Global Sharing Economy Expert. Then next to speak will be Eva Pascoe, on my immediate right, who is Chair Digital Network Cybersalon, co-founder Cyberia, the world's first internet cafe, co-author and alternative future high street for the UK. And then next to speak will be Lesley Curwen, on my immediate left, business, economics and personal finance journalist, BBC writer and speaker. And then finally to speak will be Rob Killick on my far right, CEO Clerkswell and a long-time business guy in the digital space. Right, so first up will be Benita.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for sharing, first of all. So I'm going to start with a definition of the sharing economy, because this is one of the misconceptions. People don't actually really understand what we're talking about. So just to be really clear, a sharing economy is a system that is built around the sharing of human, intellectual and physical resources. And that's really important because that's what the sharing is in the sharing economy. It's access to a shared resource. And that access doesn't necessarily have to be free, it's access to a shared resource. So it might be that you pay for it, it could be rented, it could be swapped, it could be exchanged, so different kinds of value exchange in a sharing economy. Because the sharing economy is a hybrid economy. So that means that it's about choice. It's about that shared choice and that opportunity. So the sharing economy is a system of many, many choices. And as a global sharing economy expert, I've spent the last 5 years gathering evidence on the sharing economy. And earlier this year, I launched a report called What We Know About the Global Sharing Economy. And what we did at Compare and Share was we aggregated all of the data from around the world, all of the numerous studies on the sharing economy, and we put them into a very accessible report. Now, what we've learned from putting this data together is there are £3.5 trillion worth of idle resources in the world, or at least more than that. Yet there are 40,000 people that die each year because of lack of access to food, shelter and water. And so a sharing economy creates an efficient system. It creates a system and a world that works. Now, the reason that I set out to gather the data was because I wanted to know the truth about the sharing economy. And so here it is. We are witnessing a seismic shift. We are witnessing the breakdown of capitalism as we know it. And this new system is emerging. It's not perfect, it's not finished, it's emerging. What we know is that the sharing economy is creating economic, environmental and social value. So in terms of economic value, the headline finding from our report was that the sharing economy as a market is growing faster than Facebook, Google and Yahoo combined. And that's based on PwC's very conservative valuation of the market. And I say it's conservative because it only looks at 5 sectors, 5 verticals within the market. And we know that there are 17 because we've mapped it and we have a global directory with 17 different verticals and close to 8,000 different sharing sites from around the world. But when we start to look at the value that it's really bringing to people, to society, for example, car sharing, just take car sharing alone, saving 3 million tonnes of carbon each year. Peer-to-peer parking, reducing congestion and pollution by 30%. And then we start to look at poverty reduction. Now, last year, one single organisation, FareShare, here in the UK, diverted food from landfill and delivered 15 million meals to people living in food poverty here in the UK. That's one organisation. Craigslist diverted 5 million tonnes of goods from landfill last year. We also know a recent study by Aaron Sundararajan at NYU Stern showed that the sharing economy is creating 3 times greater social benefit for people from low-income backgrounds. At Compare and Share, we worked with Macmillan Cancer Support to build a peer-to-peer task-sharing platform to enable volunteers to share their time with people living with cancer, to carry out everyday activities that they needed, their laundry doing, their shopping doing. We've seen the sharing economy literally saving lives. iHelp is an app that connects first aiders so they can reach people having a cardiac arrest, and they're reaching them 10 times faster than the emergency services can. They are saving lives. That's what the sharing economy is doing. So what we need to be doing is we need to understand it. We need to showcase these incredible innovations. We need to share the successes. Now, the opponents of the sharing economy tend to fall in 2 camps, in my experience. Either those that don't understand it, or those that are threatened by it. Now, those that don't understand it generally don't understand that the sharing refers to the access of a shared resource, not that it's free. It's a hybrid economy, as I've said, and that there are different forms of value exchange. They also don't understand that the sharing economy is 7 years old. Now, how many 7-year-olds do you know that have everything figured out? So it's emerging. The infrastructure is being built. And no, sharing isn't new. To share is to be human. We wouldn't have survived as humanity if it weren't for sharing. The other camp, people who are threatened by it, because the sharing economy is disrupting every sector. And now people can trade peer-to-peer. They're no longer reliant on large corporations for their goods and services. They can interchangeably be the creators, producers, and suppliers of goods and services. So some people have everything to lose in a sharing economy. Simply put, they don't want to share. It's fortunate then that they'll soon be in a minority, because what we know is that 28% of people globally are already engaging in sharing economy activities, and we know that's going to double within the next year. So when you look at the evidence, the truth is clear. When you talk to people actually working in the sharing economy, their experience is positive. Yes, I'm talking about Uber drivers and taskers and hosts. The sharing economy is creating tremendous amount of opportunities. Those who attack the sharing economy have everything to lose. Those who understand it know we have everything to lose if we don't support it and help it to flourish. So this sharing economy, a sustainable economic system built around the sharing of human, intellectual and physical resources. As the evidence shows, the sharing economy is our future economy. I'm Benita. Thanks for sharing.
Give Benita a round of applause. Okay, next up, Eva.
Right, thank you very much for joining us at the session. My name is Eva Pascoe, and I wandered into the sharing economy conversation through a very different project, looking at the success of the high street. About a couple of years ago, we started writing a project for a high street minister and assessing what happens in the high streets in the evening and how can we help the high streets to revive themselves. And one thing that popped out quite quickly is that the participation of women in the night economy has been increasing, and we couldn't quite understand why. So we started digging into it, and what seems to be happening is that women are much safer, much happier to use Uber, the poster child for the sharing economy. So when, before 2012, to go out for the wild night was always tempting, but for women it was always scary because the journey back loomed as a big risk. And what happened in 2012, Uber launched just before the Olympics, and only 90 drivers. But those 90 drivers got a lot of press because suddenly it appeared it was a safe option to come back home with at 2 in the morning from Soho after 10 pints of beer. And I'm not passing any judgments, but women do participate in night economy fully. So the problem of getting ourselves home in the evening was emerging as more and more problematic before Uber. So we started looking at the numbers, and the numbers are quite interesting. It appears that the sharing economy has landed in the eye of the cyclone because the Conservative government started cutting policing down about the same time. So if you look at the crime down in London, it's all kind of big story, but the truth of the matter is that sexual offenses on the buses have been going up every year since about 2009, and they are higher and higher. So you're really taking your life in your own hands when you hit back Trafalgar Square at 2 in the morning. And people know it. Those stories go out very quickly. So what we realized that what was happening was a disregard by the police of the sexual offenses on the buses. Very, very many times we heard the story, she was asking for it by coming back at 2 in the morning drunk. Well, that's neither here nor there, but the policing of buses was very, very poor. And Uber landed at this point with the sharing data, where the sharing is crowdsourcing of the reputation. Uber technology actually is quite complex, and there's a lot to it, but the core, which is playing out, is the crowdsourcing of drivers' reputation. And taking out the cash, which means the driver is safer as well, because nobody's that interested in robbing non-cash carrying driver. So sharing reputations, crowdsourcing of reputations have really made a big difference to people. And women develop trust. So despite having the headlines in Daily Mail, Mohammed has raped somebody on the way to Sydenham, or another Arabic-sounding name has had sexual offense problem driving to Barnet. Suddenly people were able to discover the difference between what drives Daily Mail and their racist headlines, because they never write about English guys doing exactly the same. Even recently, there was a big black cab story about black cab driver being caught with sexual offenses, and that made tiny, tiny mention in Daily Mail. So our risk perception is completely skewed against ethnic minority drivers, where the reality actually wasn't quite as bad. So Uber has managed to differentiate the reality and the probabilities which are real versus the probabilities that you think are there if you keep staring at Daily Mail headlines. So what we notice is the sort of, hotspot for sharing economy in terms of transport occurred as a result of really poor policing and ignoring of women's sexual offense problem on the buses. So where Uber competes with buses. It doesn't compete with black cabs because they're way too expensive. Most people can't afford them. But where people would normally go on a bus and take their life in their own hands, now they happily jump into Uber. Not only is safe, it's convenient, and it's cheaper. That's where we come to the problem, and I'm not really of Kool-Aid view of sharing economy in the slightest, because the labor relations problem, which I'm sure Rob will talk about, are problematic. Increase of the traffic and pollution as a result of Uber registering almost 120,000 minicab drivers is big. But we cannot replace the problem that Uber solved, safety for women. And that is absolutely black and white, because the number of offenses, sexual attacks by minicab drivers was down 2013 by 50%. The rapes were down by 30%. These are big numbers. So we have to be very aware that the trust that the solution that Uber proposes is successful. It succeeded in establishing a safe system. Their safety record is second to none. While before, the police were just not interested. Nobody was interested in what women were doing at 2 o'clock in the morning on Trafalgar Square. It's your problem, honey. So you can dislike and object and have a campaign against the labor law. I'm sure we'll discuss that. But there's no denying that a problem was solved. So just to sort of round up in terms of the sharing economy in the transport situation, it's not just crowdsourcing of the reputation of the driver, of the reputation of the passenger, because obviously there's a lot of passengers who are problematic. So more drivers are prepared to drive. More people are prepared to join essentially quite risky business. So the pool of people who are willing to take on minicab driving has increased massively because the safety is so much better. So I think we need to understand what's the sharing bit here, because there is many different types of sharing. This one is sharing data and reputation of the driver, and that is the key. So just to round it up, the problem with Uber for me is that the same result could be achieved without a single company doing that. There is nothing in Uber technology that means only Uber can do that. Any cab cooperative could be doing exactly the same. It's just a combination of features on an app. And we've seen a very, very interesting app coming out of Minnesota, which basically is driving a taxi in Minnesota as a cooperative platform, having exactly the same reputation solution. So women can vote on the reputation of the driver, but it's not owned by one big company, it's owned by the guys who drive it. So you have to separate Uber technology from Uber. We don't need Uber to have Uber technology.
Thank you. Okay, Lesley.
I'm a consumer journalist. I present Moneybox Live and an investigative journalist too. So my take on this is actually about consumer protection. And I would argue that renting a room, sharing a car, hiring a tool from somebody through the sharing economy, yes, it might be cheaper, possibly friendlier as an experience than you'd get from a big company, but it still feels like it's a bit of a gamble. What I'm suggesting is that you don't know what's going to happen if something goes wrong still in the sharing economy. I think for the platforms involved to change that is going to involve more regulation, which means more cost and more standardisation. And, will that erode the whole point of this as an alternative? Let's go from macro to micro. Insurance. So you go to your Airbnb room in the lovely coastal gem of Lytham in Lancashire, and your host hasn't noticed that there's a pool of water in the bathroom. You trip over it and you break a leg. It's a bad break and you don't work for several months. Or the house is burgled while you're there and your stuff is stolen. Now, would any of that be covered by standard home insurance? No, it wouldn't. It doesn't cover boarders and paying guests. Airbnb can't provide the insurance. It doesn't own the asset. In the United States, it does now offer something called host protection insurance. If the guest gets injured, there's up to $1 million of cover, but that's only in the United States. There's nothing protecting you here. So what about the insurance situation for somebody doing a car share? Would you be fully insured if there was an accident? Well, the insurance industry is worried about this. BIBA, the British Insurance Brokers Association, have produced guidance. You would have to add business use to your policy if you share a commute with a colleague, picking them up from a different place. You might need a special hire and reward cover if you make a profit out of it. And that Airbnb owner in Lytham will need a specialist short-term landlord cover, and that's expensive. All this is adding costs. How many of those people working in the sharing economy actually do have the right insurance? Well, we don't know, do we? We can't tell. BIBA says that it's working with members to bring in new products which ensure the use of the item rather than the ownership. It's a key point. But it could be cumbersome at the moment to get the right insurance. Last November, there was a review commissioned by the Department for Business Innovation and Skills, which said that the law must be changed to accommodate the sharing economy, including knocking down barriers in the insurance industry. But this review said regulations on accommodation should be revisited to ensure they are still fit for purpose. Now, does that mean weakened? Because if it does, I'm worried about that. Back to our consumer. He or she may not know what the insurance situation is. They won't know whether there's any tax being paid on the profits. Is that one of the reasons why it's so cheap? They might wonder. It may not be in all cases, but you wonder about it. The Inland Revenue clearly says there's tax due on selling your services online. Now, if the consumer's feeling generous, they may be concerned about those actually working in the sharing economy who don't have any of the usual protections, like the minimum wage, sickness pay, holiday pay, pension, the kind of hard-won protections which have taken decades to be accepted as the way we should treat workers. So do both the consumer and the sharing economy business tacitly accept that this is a slightly shadowy world apart in commercial terms, where the norms do not yet apply? And if so, that really is radical capitalism, but I would argue that it is possibly disruptive and dangerous for the wider economy. There's an argument that the reason why multinational hotel chains charge more than a sharing economy business is, yes, it's partly because a profit goes to shareholders, I agree, but they may be offering you implicit protections such as safety standards and insurance, which we all take for granted. If they fail us, we can complain. We could even try and sue them because they've got deep pockets. And are you going to try and sue the guy in Lytham? It's a different kind of consumer psychology. The report for the Department of Business suggested that there should be a trade body for the sharing economy, funded by its members, establishing kite marks, dispute resolution, the right to redress, and providing insurance. Well, fine. But that's another cost. It's another level of infrastructure which I would have thought would be anathema to the kind of individualistic micro-entrepreneurs that we're talking about here. And surely it's just reinventing the wheel. So I think if we're going to protect consumers properly and protect the workers providing the services and not erode our hard-won labour standards, then it is going to cost more than it does now. And if it costs too much, then the competitive advantage will be lost. And I think those bullish forecasts about the growth of this sector will prove to be hype after all.
Thank you. Thank you, Lesley. Okay, last up, Rob.
I'm not an opponent of the sharing economy in any sense, really, but I am opposed to the inflated claims that are made about it being either the end of capitalism or the solution to the major economic problems that we face. So that's my opening gambit here. Now, I always like to include a dead philosopher in my little speeches, and today's choice is Karl Marx. Now, Karl Marx, when asked what the future would be like, said that it would be possible for him to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticise after dinner, just as I feel like. In other words, he was saying that once we've reached a state of economic abundance, then people will be able to choose what they want to do rather than be forced to do it in order to survive. Now, the modern version of this, which is on the front page of the Times last week, some of you may have seen it, headline, "Children will work until they hit 100, heads told." And the futurologist who said this, a man called Rohit Talwar, said that, that the jobs as we know it will disappear, and instead we will be driving Uber taxis part of the day, renting out our spare bedroom on Airbnb, renting out space in our closet, doing delivery for Amazon, renting out our driveway for somebody who wants to park their car there. What a utopian life we're looking forward to. It's fantastic, isn't it? So when we look at a new phenomenon like the sharing economy, I think we have to avoid the common mistake, which is either to say that everything has changed or that nothing has changed. Now, I'm in neither of those positions. I think change is going on. But what I want to focus on is not so much what's new about the sharing economy, but what is not new. Because I think there is lots of things which are not new in the sharing economy. I think a lot of it is what I would call old wine in new bottles, or old activities which have been rebranded to fit a new ideological framework. So if you look at what constitutes the sharing economy, by general definition, things like Airbnb, Uber, the hosts of much smaller marketplaces which are proliferating, cooperative activity, peer-to-peer lending, and other things which, strictly speaking, are sharing, such as file sharing, which is borderline illegal, prostitution, which has been going on for a long time, which is very much a sharing activity. These things, when you break them down, are largely old forms of capitalist and business activity. So if you let out your house, your driveway, or your bicycle to somebody else, you're not sharing it with them, you're selling part of it to them. They are paying you for your service, for your possession. If you use an internet platform to create a new marketplace, what you're doing is a classic piece of what's called cutting out the middlemen. It's the disintermediation which the internet has enabled to happen. So you don't go to a record shop, you go online and you do it there. If you are maximizing the use of your office by renting out small spaces to it, or your home or anything else, or your car, it's what's called in the business sweating the assets to get the most out of your investment. If you are breaking up or disrupting an existing industry, such as Uber has done with the taxi business, or Airbnb to a lesser extent with the hotel industry, you are doing what Schumpeter called 70 years ago creative disruption in the capitalist economy. It's absolutely classic stuff. There's nothing new to see here in any of those activities. Now, I'm not disputing in any way that these things can have a very positive impact for consumers. And I think, that in a period of stagnating wages and general economic stagnation, it's been very helpful for people to be able to use Airbnb rather than pay for an expensive hotel or get a cheaper taxi ride. And I think that the recession has had a big impact, in fact, in encouraging people to go down that route. But that's a failure. We should see that as a failure. We have failed to create a dynamic, productive economy with more investment and, in fact, more disruption of the old economies, and we are sharing out the misery. It shows a poverty of ambition, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. So I guess that's the kind of question I want to pose back to the panel then, really. Is the sharing economy kind of an adequate sort of long-term response to our sort of social, economic and political problems that we are faced with right now? It's kind of really posed back to, I guess, Benita to start with, in terms of how you might respond to that. Is it an adequate kind of response to some of the social issues you pointed out in terms of inequality, poverty?
I mean, the reason why I see that it clearly is an adequate response is because what we're seeing some really concrete, specific examples of how this is actually working in practice. And that's really what I'm interested in, what's actually happening out there. And I wanted to come back on some of the really important points that Lesley made, because trust is absolutely at the heart of this. It is absolutely at the heart of it. And one of the things that we've been doing is developing a trust mark called Share Trade. And what Share Trade does is it acts as a trust mark. It enables people to be able to transact safely in the sharing economy. And it has 4 different aspects to it. So number 1 is insurance. You absolutely need to have those insurances in place because things do go wrong, stuff happens, and we need to make sure that there is the infrastructure in place for when it does, that's taken care of. So insurances and relevant insurance products, and there's a lot of work happening in the insurance sector to create those products that are relevant to the sharing of assets. So that's something that's absolutely being delivered already. Then we look at, for example, ratings and reviews and reputation capital. That's another aspect of this Share Trade mark. And what it means is that we know a lot about the people who we're sharing assets with before we do that. We know a lot about their reputation. The third aspect is around verification. Now, just to give you a really specific example of how well this is working. So, we've all known, for example, that we've had these CRB or DBS checks that have generally been used. Well, in the sharing economy, we use software, we use different new innovative technologies to be able to verify that people are who they say they are. Now, these technologies are far more robust than our kind of old systems ever will be. And I'll give you a really concrete example of that. We worked with Macmillan Cancer Support, as I mentioned, to build a task-sharing platform, sending complete strangers into ill people's homes. Now, obviously, that had to be an incredibly safe operation, right? Absolutely safe. We had to know that those people were absolutely who they say they are. And we integrated one of our partners, Verido software. Now, it's really interesting that Macmillan have decided now that they're going to roll out this technology across their other services because they've realised it's far more accurate. It's giving far more accurate data. So actually, contrary to some of the views that have been represented here, the sharing economy actually in the technology that it uses, and that's the only part that's new, is the technology, not the fact that we're sharing, is in fact creating a much safer way. But more importantly, the sharing economy is about a better experience. It's about connecting with other people. It's about being part of a community. It's about living a life worth living. It's about giving value back to people and to the planet. That's why it's a solution. That's why it's important.
Lesley and Eva, I mean, do you want to come back to those kind of points?
I think if indeed, there are moves to make sure that there is insurance and that there are ratings and verification of identity, all those things are fantastic. But are they going to be standard across the entire sharing economy? I suspect not for a good long while. I know you've said it's a young industry. I understand that. I think that there are still too many worries for me on behalf of consumers about how it's working right now. And I can see that the whole sector needs to shake itself out, but it is so disparate and so diverse and so global that I'm not quite sure how you are going to get those standards in place.
My concern about the well-being of sharing economy and the reputation management is that it's doing the right things for us. It's definitely delivering more consumers to the high street in the evening, which was my original point about the innovation and use of high streets in the evening, which we need. But I wouldn't get too excited about that sharing economy being a solution to anybody's employment problems, because this is just massive piece of software doing lots of things really well and a little warm body, de-skilled to the last layer at the end of it. So Uber drivers need to do very little at the moment. They don't need to have knowledge. They don't need to learn. They just need to be safe, and they need to be human. And apart from that, it's a quite low-level requirement, which will be automated out with the next round of automated cars. So they're really keeping the seat warm for the proper robots. So let's not get too excited about it, because what stares it, if you go to Uber's offices, Airbnb offices, Google offices, you know what you see? Big rooms with empty buildings. There is a couple of bean bags, there is a ping pong table, and there are no people, because the code does everything. There's only a couple of guys in a hoodie who get all the billions, and there is no people. So these offices are staffed by very, very low number of people. So the management job's gone. If it's a flow chart, if it's a diagram, it's automated already. The drivers, they're for probably another few years, not for long. So what we really have to look is much bigger, is basically automation ripping through everybody's job, including mine, because insight and marketing research, most of it gone to SurveyMonkey anyway, but what's left will be going soon to another pile of code. So we have to be very, very wide lens looking what is not to be automated, or how can we educate everybody to death that they can be the creative writers and they can be the hoodies.
I mean, on that as well, Rob, because in one level, when it comes to, if you like, customer satisfaction, isn't it, in some ways a direct challenge to a lot of large corporates who themselves have suffered many times over, damages to their reputation because they're not able to kind of connect with the customer, shall we say, and provide them a very, intuitive service, where it seems to be at one level at least, the sharing economy lets real people connect with the real sort of people at the end who provide the service, such as the drivers. I mean, how do you respond to that? Is that...
Well, I don't have a problem with a lot of the specific examples. I mean, I've been as frustrated with black cab drivers in London as I'm sure everybody else is. That only 10% of them take credit cards and all this kind of stuff. It's really irritating. Great. Good luck to Uber and all the other pirate capitalists who've moved in to take advantage of, outdated services and everything else. I've got nothing against that at all. But I think what we're talking about, it's the fact that it's really what Eva was saying. This is not the solution to our economic problems. It's almost all operates in what I would call the circulation of already existing commodities, houses, taxes, everything else. It doesn't create anything new. It just shares things out that already exist, sometimes perhaps more fairly, sometimes perhaps more efficiently. You know, fine, good luck with that and everything else. But it doesn't impact on the production, the productive capacity of society. And that is, going back to Marx, that's what will create the economic wealth, which will make us all wealthier and perhaps happier in the future. So that's my critique of it. You know, it's okay. Most of it I'm fine with, right? But it's not the solution to the investment problem, to the productivity problem, to unemployment problem, all that kind of stuff.
I mean, Benita, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to look at, I mentioned this figure of the £3.5 trillion worth of idle resources, and we know it's much more than that. You know, so essentially what the sharing economy is creating new value, because it's creating value out of something that is idle. It's idling capacity. It's going to landfill. It's seen as waste. You know, in a sharing economy, waste is just resource in the wrong place. It's about matching that idling capacity with need. That's what it does. So it's all about creating new value. Everything that we do at Compare and Share is about creating new value. It's also creating huge amounts of environmental value. You start to look at the carbon that's lowered, the goods that are diverted from landfill, let alone the social value, the connections that are being made. We're talking about building connected, bonded, sustainable communities where people know their neighbours, where they're connected through those kinds of bonds. That's what we're talking about, because the sharing economy is a people's economy. It puts people at the heart of it. So to give this idea that it doesn't create any value, I mean, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Of course, it's creating a huge amount of value.
Okay, Eva, do you want to...
Just very briefly, I think also the value is created already by providing, Uber provides more customers to the high street in the evening. This is the whole percentage of layer of customers that were not there before. So that creates bigger budgets for the microbreweries, who then create employment in other places. So, you know, just getting people to the right place in the right part might be questionable in terms of how they got there, but they got there, they consume. So that part of loosening up of the transport, lower price is definitely important.
Okay, Lesley, do you want to...
Very briefly, I just wanted to say about the 3.5 million in idle trillion in idle resources. Does that include my drill that sits there? And I do use it quite a lot, actually. But it sits there some of the year, and I don't use it. But I'm quite happy. I paid £30 for it several years ago. I'm not about to throw that in landfill. That can last another 20 years, because I don't agree with how you're defining idle resources. And I think are you talking about everybody's drills sitting in our cupboards?
It doesn't look at everyone's. It doesn't include everyone's drills. It includes the things that we never use, the stuff that sits in our cupboards, the stuff that we don't use.
How can you quantify that?
That's what we've looked at. We've looked at things like we have looked at empty seats in cars. So we've looked at the cars that are not used. We know that the average car sits unused for 23 hours and 15 minutes a day. There have been 2 pieces of research that have shown that. So we are able to quantify some of these things. Now, that figure of 3.5 trillion, we actually know that the real figure is much higher than that. It's much, much higher than that. But that's what we were able to quantify. But it's looking at actual data, looking at these idle goods. We know averagely, each of us in the UK has £3,500 worth of stuff in our cupboards that we don't use.
Okay, Rob, do you want to just quickly maybe respond to that it does create value?
Well, it doesn't create value. It means you get more value out of something that's already exists, which is fine. But what's new about that? My neighbour comes around and borrows my lawnmower all the time. In fact, I would say that insofar as I'd say that there's a depletion of social bonds, if anything, because what I'm being encouraged to do in the sharing economy is not to lend it to him, but to rent it to him instead. Right? And so instead of doing him a favour, this is how I'm supposed to make my living out of this. So I think there's lots of things here which are assertions, right? And which and also I think there's I think the consumer protection stuff is an issue in some instances as well. We're walking into something here that we need to examine very carefully and not get carried away with it and see where the real benefits are. And there are benefits, no doubt about that.
Okay, good. So it's already got a bit lively. Now I want to pass it over to you guys. So what I'm going to do is take rounds of kind of questions, and you can make points as well. So you can have your own opinion.
I'm not sure of your name.
Benita.
Benita, you made the point that this is changing capitalism. This is you're very excited that this is going to somehow change the world. I'm in technology. That's what I do for a living, and I'm really excited about using technology to change the world that I can touch. And I work with clients who are also very excited, and I love the passion. And so we've got a lot in common. But when I grew up, I was living on a street with about 5 cars, and my mother used to get a lift from my neighbour's family to get to the shop so she could buy food. We used to have a party phone which we shared with our neighbours. There were about 4 or 5 phones on the street. Most of my clothes came from my cousins because we couldn't afford to buy clothes. When I bought books, I didn't buy books, I swapped books in a second-hand shop. Most of my life was about sharing. My mother used to do charity work. I think what you're talking about is an acceleration of something. You're talking about finding assets that are being used. That's the history of the world. That's what we did since we came down from the trees. We find better ways to use assets. And what I'm seeing today is an acceleration of technology, information that allows us to do what we call disintermediation. That's all we're really talking about. Changing capitalism, no. And I hope I don't end up having to rent out my spare room and my driveway in order to be able to eat food. I hope that day doesn't come.
A question for Rob, actually. So I agree, it's a bit of a BS sort of category, but we've talked a lot about what hasn't changed. What has changed? I mean, there's obviously the technology, there's the mobile phone app economy side of things, but is there something new in the level of scale, the global scale of Airbnb or Uber? I'm just interested in what is actually new here.
Just interested in the impact on economic growth, because obviously more people sharing the same tools is less people buying tools for themselves, like a hammer or drill, whatever it is. And since our economy is based on consumption of resources, since that's now threatening the earth as we know it, is it a good thing to start to think about scaling back economic growth and actually moving to a steady state economy? And would the sharing economy have a place in that shift in thinking?
Benita's point mentioned a few times about how this is more connecting and more human. I can see that often it might be, but is this not something specific about the sharing economy? It's actually about trying to find forms of business interaction which cut out anonymous, faceless, global corporations, these big bogey people. I go to lots of places near me which are like small independent businesses, family-run businesses, self-employed people, cooperatives, and I do that with people over the world as well. In all those cases, I think I'm getting a very human, connected experience, and that has nothing to do with the shared economy.
A question to Benita as well, because that figure, 3.5 trillion, is actually mind-blowing. But is it accurate? For example, when you, as somebody said already, when you use something, when you share something, you don't use something else. So, for example, people sharing cars or using Uber are not going to use public transport. People sharing books are not going to use libraries. So how do you actually count the number to 3.5 trillion? You need to take into account the things that are not the resources that are not going to be used because of sharing economy. So I think it might kind of level itself.
My question is, Benita, you mentioned there are other people who either don't understand it or who are threatened by it. Do you have specific advice to give to the category of people who are threatened by it? Taxi companies, for example, what would you say to them?
I think it's not so much a question, but more of a consideration. There's been a kind of brush over the technologies that actually make a lot of that possible in terms of digital, and there's an assumption that somehow that stuff is simple to produce. It's not simple to produce, has the same risks as manufacture and scaled in a very similar way in terms of the actual trade assets you're building. How much consideration really being given to that? Because that could derail all of this.
Slightly related to that, I was just thinking about the difference between traditional manufacturing as a way to build growth versus services, and what's the role of the sharing economy in that. And I'm thrilled that the sharing economy is helping us go out and enjoy the nightlife. That's an aspect that I've never thought of. Final sort of remark is around, again, measurement. How do we know how much is in the sharing economy how much growth there is, what is the sharing economy? I think these are really important questions for our 7-year-old.
Right, so panellists, you've got a fair amount of stuff to kind of answer if you so wish. So you've got stuff about measurement. Does it all add up? Is it just about normal kind of business interaction in terms of how to encourage people to talk to each other in a sort of disintermediated way? Or even elsewhere, comments about should it be really a sign that we should scale back the kind of real economy and sort of, make do with less? So who wants to come back to some of these points? Rob?
Well, just on the question of what's changed, because I think that is interesting. I think, it has been touched on already, but I think what the internet has enabled us to do is to create global marketplaces in a way that never existed before. And as part of, I would say, the kind of general trend towards globalization, I think the internet's played a pretty significant technological underpinning of much of what constitutes globalization. But I think what it's specifically done is, and what is kind of new, is it has created these enormous corporations such as Airbnb and Uber with these fantastic valuations which have no assets and no people, right? I mean, it's just phenomenal. By any standard business judgment, these companies should be virtually worthless, right? They have nothing. And they're just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because as you go further down the pyramid, there are more and more smaller companies who are very, very, very similar. This trend away from actually owning anything, people or whatever, is very, very significant. It does have a big impact, as Eva said, it's going to have a big impact on employment and everything else. So I think that is a new thing. It's interesting. It also enables the situation which I'm sure most of us are very cross about, which is that a lot of these big corporations pay no tax anywhere. They are really, I use the term pirate capitalists. It's slightly affectionate, right, because I do admire them. But I think that they are a kind of new type of bandit, right, in their nice kind of T-shirts and everything. And well, good luck to them, but I'm not sure the rest of us should be that happy that that's the situation that we're in.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think the biggest pirate of them all is sometimes the state, because you have to remember that the cost of minicap license, it's quite a bit of money, and that goes to the state, which I'm not entirely sure what the state would get involved into my journey by taxi to town. Where is the place for the state there? So I'm just throwing it in. Who are the pirates? But we have to face what's changed. We are operating in a global economy. And we are still people with very limited ability to form relationships. I think Robin Dunbar was talking at Nesta a couple of days ago. He said, we are still, despite all this internet, stuck at 150 people we can just about remember the names of. And when it comes to it, our mental capacity for relationship has not grown. It is still the 150 people that we vaguely know and 5 people we know well. And there is not much change in our capacity. So what happened is these boys with the hoods and the coat managed to open up our catchment area. So instead of me lending you the drill, as we're on the drill topic, I now can lend the drill to somebody who's in Holland. Hey, so I just opened up the lifespan value of my drill. I'm happy. So it's a good thing by opening the catchment area, by allowing us to create trust in people who we never met before. So the trust is based on creation of the identity, of sharing information about Rob and how well he drives, and does he look after his drills well? And if all comes check, 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 and his index values, then I lend him my drill, I go into his cab, no problem. So we suddenly made that jump from 150 people in our head and physical relationship to billions of people who we can have a relationship, at least over the drill. It might not be the best quality, but So I think this is what's happening. We're basically opening up catchment areas for our assets. And how we deal with it is another matter. Taxes, I totally agree. But the technology has allowed us to move beyond what anthropology would say gift economy, where I have to know everybody to have a relationship with them commercially. Now I don't need to know anybody.
But is there, just to come back on that a little bit, what's the space for privacy in that world where, if you like, everything is kind of rated and sort of validated through these apps and the sharing economy?
Oh, well, that's a different story, which is why we lead in the campaign for UK Digital Bill of Rights. First point of which is my data is my data. Because ideally, you really want to be at the will to open up this data and close them back. Open up and close them back. At the moment, we have absolutely no option. The data just floating around there with 120 companies using it at the same time. You are being tracked on the average by 150 to 200 companies every click of the way. And that obviously is a massive problem because that's asset of us. So I have this lovely friend who has just incorporated herself as a person. So she's now the corporation. If you incorporate each of you as a person, suddenly you're sitting on quite a lot of assets because you can start selling the data. So all we just need is to give you tools to enable it. So not just, being the kind of free slavery for Zuckerberg every time you put an update to your mates what you've been up to, but actually owning that update and being able to utilize that to the advertising. So that's still to come. But, this is partly legal, partly technology.
Okay. Lesley, do you want to?
Yes, I wanted to talk to the point from somebody about whether this is actually changing capitalism, as we've heard claimed, and the suggestion that actually it's just an acceleration of finding assets that are not used. I mean, I think that makes sense to me, because what we're talking about here are some very big, very powerful companies. That is capitalism. Sorry, guys, but let me just tell you a little bit about AirBnB, which the most recent funding round it had was by venture capital firms, private equity, various Chinese firms. There is a lot of power there, and there is very little accountability. I think that we need to be thinking about how you democratize the platforms, which is probably a whole different discussion. But Eva's point about how there are very low numbers of people in these businesses, and we need to make sure that they are accountable, because boy, they wield a lot of heft.
I'd like to just address that point about specific advice to people who feel threatened by it, because we haven't really addressed that yet. What's happening in the sort of corporate world, and we work a lot with corporates actually, and essentially it's really about understanding that the sharing economy is an opportunity to do better business. And that's how I see it. I'm a passionate social entrepreneur, as you can possibly tell, and I'm interested in how we can use business as a force for good. And so, recently I was addressing the Tourism Alliance, and obviously there's been a huge shake-up in the tourist industry by, companies like Airbnb. And my advice really to them was that, in terms of hotels and traditional tourist businesses, they really need to be essentially better sharers than Airbnb. And what I mean by that is this is an opportunity for those businesses to create better businesses, to create that social value, to offer a positive experience where money is going into the local economy. Because that's what happens when you go and you use one of these peer-to-peer accommodation services. Actually what happens is your cash goes into the local economy. You support those local businesses. When you do a house swap, for example, same thing. Someone recommends to you, the person whose home you're staying in, they recommend to you all these places to go and visit and where to spend your cash in the local economy. So it has a positive impact on the local economy. And there are lots of corporations that are starting to embrace this, either through their corporate social responsibility and through programs like enabling car sharing and so on. So that it's a good thing. It's a good thing, it's an opportunity, and it's a good thing. And then just to come back on this point about measurement, because measurement is really, really important. And one of the things I absolutely agree, from having gathered all this data from around the world, what we absolutely know is that there is simply not enough data about the social impact and the environmental impact. We've got some data, but actually relatively little. And one of the things that we've set out to do is we're building a tool, probably not surprisingly and possibly amusingly, called a shareometer. And we're actually setting out to track and measure the good that the sharing economy is doing, because we want to know. We have some indication of it, but I agree, we've got a long way to go.
So everyone is trying to give kind of a ideological justification to the sharing economy, whether it will save the economy or whether it will save the environment. The question is, why should we even bother? I mean, it's good in itself. It can bring into contact people who both want to enter in a relationship. So why is this not the end of the discussion? Why shall we care whether it will save the world or whatever?
I want to push back on this idea that encouraging people to share assets for money somehow builds better communities. and it's all based on trust. It strikes me that if you're sharing your asset for money, you don't trust, because money is a means of pricing risk. The more, when we lend somebody something, we charge a higher price for lending it if we think we aren't going to get it back. So I fail to see how charging money for using your asset it builds better communities. It strikes me that it could actually build worse ones.
Okay, good point. So,
yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think it is the opposite of what you're saying. As soon as we transform what would be informal relationships between us into formalized contracts, we no longer trust. We're looking back to a system of law that ensures that if we don't get the positive result, we've got access to getting compensation or whatever. If you trust somebody, you give something to somebody without any expectation of anything coming back. So you're doing the exact opposite. And that's what I find really extraordinary about this discussion, is that the language that we're using is so, we don't interrogate this in any way whatsoever. I think, I think I'd be a lot harder on this than Rob's being. I think the whole concept of the sharing economy is a completely parasitic concept. You're talking about all this wonderful technology. Where did this technology come from? Who invested in this in the first place? You think this was given to us by God? And suddenly we woke up and we now got this ability to create these apps where we can test each other's, what our requirements might be, or whether we trust, or whether they've got good reputations or whatever. Billions were invested years ago. Companies that took risks, that did research without knowing what the outcomes were going to be, that ensured that we had economic growth, that created productive investments. Where is any of that in this discussion? We're talking about sharing out the miserable crap that we have in our society without really thinking about what could we be doing more in the future. Where's the future investment? We're living off the past, and all we're doing is we're sharing out what exists. We're not talking about what we're going to create more in the future. And if we want to solve the big problems that we've got, the last thing we need is more sharing. What we need is much more focus on investment, on productive investment, and creating new industries and creating real jobs, not jobs like we were at the beginning of the century, where we would all turn up at the factory gate and a few of us would get work for the day, and the rest had to go home and starve.
Just wanted to know what you thought about sort of what you're saying about companies like Uber that are owned by the drivers, and possibly technology being a way that, if you have like open sourcing, so like Linux and stuff like that, that's allowing lots of people to come together to create something that they can all own or no one can own, and whether that's going to be more disruptive to capitalism than the sharing economy.
I just wanted to mention, I don't know if there are people here who know about book towns. I don't know much about them, but they're a sort of the Uber sharing economy that was that's really enjoyed, and I think it's still functioning really well. But it's without the big corporation with the technology. And I think the thing that I'm getting is that everyone enjoys the sharing economy. It's a fun thing. And going back to Eva's point, that basically maybe we just need to find a way where it isn't a big corporation that owns the technology. It comes down to that. And it's whether there's something genuinely new for the future that doesn't need a big corporation for us to do this.
I was just looking at the title of the discussion today, which was Radical Capitalism or High-Tech Pocket Money. It seems like most of the ideas are sort of supporting the idea of high-tech pocket money. I know some people can make a good business out of Airbnb, but in general, I think people might have a bit of extra cash in their pocket. I'd be interested to know what the panel thinks about the role that sharing technology has in terms of developing countries like Africa, and if they make a bigger difference there than maybe in already sort of quite highly developed markets like in the UK.
In response to the question as to why should we discuss this, why is it important? One reason is that there's a lot of mystification and a lot of confusions through the discussion of the sharing economy, as was, I think, commented on here. When the world is confusing, which it is, and particularly economic matters are confusing, I think it's incumbent upon us to be quite precise in what we're discussing and not to merge everything together. So as was said here by Norman, we use the terms sharing economy and sharing interchangeably, and they're two entirely different things. The sharing concept of helping people out helping our friends, even being part of a community, is very different to market exchange, which is what the sharing economy is about. And when you use the terms interchangeably, it adds to the mystification. Another mystification which we had is between production and consumption, right? Now, one can be anti-consumption, pro-consumption, anti-production, pro-production, but what one shouldn't do is confuse the two categories. The production of things and of services is what adds value. When those things have been produced, either in the course of production, if it's providing a service, or when it's an asset which is sitting in, supposedly in our cupboards, the assets which have been created, things which have been created, when they are then consumed, the consumption has got nothing to do with adding new value. The consumption is using those things. It's the difference between the use value, the usefulness of a thing which has been produced, either historically or in the course of being produced if it is a service, and the consumption of it. And the sharing economy has got nothing to do with enhancing production. It's entirely to do with an alternate means of consumption, right? And in that, then, we should finally then distinguish between ourselves as everyone in this room, in this conference, in this world is a consumer, right? So we should distinguish between what we think about ways of consuming things, and we may all enjoy using Uber, getting a cheaper, bed and breakfast through Airbnb. That's us as individual consumers. Distinguish that from, is this as an economic phenomenon a good thing or a bad thing? And it seems to me that it is, as you were saying up there, Rob, it has been, I'd say it's more been regressive than you've said, because actually it becomes a means of making and making and doing. It's a means of survival. It's a means of coping with an economy which isn't moving anywhere. I think it's any coincidence that the sharing economy has taken off in the last 7 years, which is entirely coincidental with a period in which we've been in stagnant living conditions, right? Stagnant take-home pay, where productivity has not been going anywhere. It's precisely in those circumstances where it's a means of coping, both for us as individuals with a society which is stagnant, but it's also, the worst thing of it is then turned into a great positive business model when people then make something of that in order to say this is an innovative new way of doing things, when actually it's just a new form of asset-light, people-light exploitation of people for low wages.
I want to bring the panel back in now to kind of deal with some of these points. So, Benita, do you want to deal with some of these criticisms and
Okay, in no particular order. So why am I interested in discussing this? Well, because quite genuinely, I actually want to make the world a better place, and I believe that the sharing economy is making the world a better place. There's a lot of evidence to show that, and I believe that there's so much more it can do. So that's why I'm here taking the time on a Saturday afternoon to discuss it. In terms of the idea and the concept that it's parasitic, so I just want to come back to the example of FareShare. So last year, this social enterprise here in the UK delivered 15 million meals to people living in food poverty, people who needed food, couldn't afford a meal, out of food that would have gone to landfill. Every single day, that single organisation is using, in some cases it's using technology to do this, but ultimately it is sharing resources. And it is saving people's lives, feeding people. So the idea that it's parasitic is absolute nonsense. That's the first thing. Okay. There's organisations like Street Bank that are connecting people in their streets. There's no money involved in that transaction. There's no transaction. It's a value exchange. But people are getting together in their streets. I have no idea why anyone would, A, consider that to be parasitic, and why anybody would object to that. It's about making the world a better place. That's really what's at the heart of the sharing economy.
Can I just say, probably in response to the last speaker's question, so really are you talking about, is not necessarily about economics and the economy, but more about the kind of the social side of, making use of what we already have and own. So it's not really, is it for you just, it's not about economics per se? It's more about social good, is that correct?
That's a really brilliant question, because actually it depends how you define things like value. There was a question here about growth. Now, I'm really interested in growth, but I'm interested in community growth. I'm interested in social growth. We've had a very, very narrow way that we have looked at growth. Now, this is not just about GDP. This is about what GDP doesn't even take into consideration community growth and social growth and environmental growth. And that's why the world has been in the mess that it's in. We need to start looking at economics differently. And that's what the sharing economy does. It puts people and planet at its heart, and it gives them value. It creates new value. But it is about a different system. Yes, it's disruptive. Yes, there will be pain. Yes, there will be people that don't like it. But the very idea that it's in some way trying to do something that is negative absolutely obscures what it actually A, set out to do, and B, actually is achieving. So let's look at what's actually happening out there and the real value that the sharing economy is creating. That's really what's important. The other point I just wanted to address was this idea about open source, for example. So open source and the maker movement is all part of the sharing economy. It's incredibly diverse. A lot of the focus and a lot of the media discussion has been around high tech and has been around Silicon Valley investments and has been around the unicorn businesses like Uber and Airbnb. But they're not representative of the real sharing economy. That's what's caught people's attention. There are some very, very large numbers around those businesses, but it's not representative of the broad base that the real sharing economy actually is about. So I think there's a lot of myths around what the sharing economy is, what it's actually doing, what it's actually achieving, who represents it. And that's also part and parcel of my point earlier that we're still in the very early days. You're right, it's come out of we chart the birth of the sharing economy back to 2008. It's born out of economic collapse and environmental and social collapse. Because, of course, we needed to reinvent the wheel. We needed to look at what had happened, our systems failing us. And ultimately, what's wrong with this world has been that there has been a shortage of sharing. And that's what the sharing economy sets out to address and fix. Okay. Because we need a future sustainable economy.
Right, so Lesley, do you want to come back to some points and even what Benita's just said?
I do. I mean, I take Benita's point that there has been some social good that comes out of it. And I think it's interesting that she's now saying that the unicorns like Uber and Airbnb are not what it's about. That's not what I understood. And I profoundly disagree with her statement that this is the breakdown of capitalism as we know it. I mean, I'm sorry, we've heard already from the last speaker that the sharing economy has nothing to do with enhancing production, and that is what, in the end, our form of capitalism is about. And I don't think that's going to go away. I'm sorry. It is fine for people to earn PIN money through the sharing economy. I suspect that's what's happening most of the time. That's fine. It's very good for them. It is not going to change the way we work substantially. It's not replacing full-time jobs that support a family. If you look at the wider economy, if the people in the sharing economy had only that income, then they probably won't be paying any tax. They're not earning enough. They get no employer benefits at all. So they are not having a positive effect on the economy. And indeed, Larry Summers and Ed Ball said as much in the report that they wrote this year for the Centre for American Progress. They said when these jobs are the only source of income for these workers, that leaves workers or the state to pay their costs. So we are not talking about a revolutionary change. It's too much hype, sorry.
Okay, Eva, do you want to come back to...
Yes, I think I would just like to come back on the open source, which really is making big difference to everybody. And if you look at retail, which is my area, until quite recently, it really wasn't possible to get up in the morning and create a new brand for women with some new clothing. And now it is very much possible. Topshop is being challenged all right, left, and center by very, very tiny businesses like Just Fab, Nasty Gal, who just pick up WooCommerce or little Shopify's or eBay and just build the brand. And if it's something that they sell that people actually like, they have a shot at it. While before open source e-commerce solutions came about, you couldn't do it. It was just not possible. And the big retail was sitting there getting a lot more profit than they actually deserve. So open source is definitely a way forward because it just lowers the cost of access, lowers the cost of ownership so much that it's really the matter of your creativity. If you've got ideas, go for it. But I also agree totally with the point about the tax, because we spent quite a lot of time looking at what happened to tax from the high street. It's sort of gone. And a lot of that is our own fault for letting it happen, but also the e-commerce economy, all the big companies, they pay nothing. I mean, nothing. So the whole thing is ridiculous. Facebook pays $4,000. Amazon pays nothing, nobody pays anything. So we're sitting here like Marx, frankly. So this is not really a sharing economy issue. It is the global tax escaping issue, but those are the companies who lead it, which is why the distrust. So if you're looking at the unicorns like Uber, Airbnb, or I'll put Amazon there, what tax? They registered in 25 places where nobody's going to ever find them. But on the plus side, I think the sharing economy has got people on the ground getting a bit more creative, because we got stagnated. I mean, I came here in 1986 from Poland, and I have to tell you that doing my first business was actually quite easy because everybody else was asleep. So, when you come from a place which is harder, you look at England and people are kind of like, they're sort of a bit too bureaucratic, too relaxed. The opportunities are lying on the ground, but nobody's taking them. So in a way, sharing economy has sort of poked people into, right, maybe I can do something. And that's a good thing, because there's an enormous amount of creative capital here. But there has been very kind of relaxed approach, well, it's only big companies, I can't do anything. And that's not true anymore.
Rob?
I think some of the things that Benita's talking about really fall into the old wine in new bottles. So there are charitable activities, cooperative activities. These didn't start in 2008. These have been going on for a very long time, and perhaps have been enhanced by new technology. Good, fine. But I think that to confuse that with a solution to our global economic problems and the problem of production and everything else is just fantastic. I mean, I've got a rule of thumb. As soon as somebody says GDP is not important, right, and then all the alarm bells go off in my head, right? Because what GDP is about how much goods and services you produce, which can then be shared out in your economy, right? So if it has to be the most important thing in any economy, right? It has to be, because without that, you do end up with Benita and other people saying that the real problem isn't the production of goods and services, it's the way we share them out. Right? And I think, if what we're saying is that the most important thing is it doesn't matter about the size of the cake, it matters how we share it out. Now, for me, I am not prepared to be partaking in a smaller and smaller slice of the cake. That doesn't satisfy me. I would like a larger slice of a larger cake. And I'm sure in the real world, that is actually what most people want. I had an interesting conversation with a young man about this, in which he was saying, we young people, we don't really believe in possessions anymore. And we just want to share everything. And then I said, what about houses? He said, oh no, I want to get on the housing ladder. There we go.
Talking about sharing, I went down to St. Catherine Dock last evening, and there were about 50 huge yachts parked there. Beautiful big yachts, not a single person on one of those yachts. How can you own a beautiful yacht and a beautiful evening in London and you're not even utilizing it? Now, that's the rich. Why aren't they doing Airbnbs on those? We wonder, well, it's because they're super rich and they've creamed it, and that's the reality. Sharing would be great when the rich share. The reality is that technology is enabling people to become smaller entrepreneurs. eBay is a perfect example. So many people trade. eBay's been going for a lot longer than Airbnb and everything else. Huge numbers of people trading, selling things, being economically active, enabling them to. Industries being challenged. The taxi industry will never survive Uber because it's new technologies, challenging skilled drivers, knowledge of where to get around. And that's a totally different conversation, but nothing to do with challenging capitalism, I'm sorry to say.
The point about the old wine in new bottles, the regressive view about, what is new about this, basically. I think there is something new about Uber and B&B, and here is what is new, I think, about it. It's not, the intrinsic act of sharing that existed ever since prostitution, the oldest profession. But what is new here is Uber and Airbnb, they've created the system, process, and platform for scalable sharing to happen. And that's how marketplace happen. So, there is something new about it, I think. And also, this idea of, is it adding value here? I think we need to take a different look at what is value creation. If we just count for, it has to be a new invention, the point that Norman made, there are bigger things to care about in this world, But I really like what Benita said of, if we were to look at waste, it's just like resource in the wrong place. We could look at redefining what is value creation by making use of the idolized, the waste resources. That is, in a way, adding value in itself.
Sorry, Rob, what you said about GDP and that being the be-all and end-all, I think that's what you said. I think that's ridiculous and it's cancerous, actually. If you think about it, there are finite resources on this planet. If we predicate our entire economy on consuming things, that's actually a very recent phenomenon. We don't have infinite wants. That's something that was manufactured in the 1920s by advertising. Before that, people in Britain, Europe, were actually generally very puritanical. The thrift was the key thing. We didn't care about the newest iPhone or the newest whatever. We didn't feel that terrible social feeling of not having, buying our clothes at a charity shop or like swapping our clothes. That's actually a very recent phenomenon that arose along with productivity. The huge productivity increases at the beginning of the century, of the last century. So what you said about having a bigger pie, yeah, that's all very well and good, but how long is that going to go on for? That can't realistically go on. I mean, we're entering the sixth extinction now, with most of our biodiversity being lost. It is very much about giving out what we have more intelligently than increasing the pie, in my opinion. Sorry, that wasn't really a question, but...
That's fine. We're keen on opinions as well.
Thanks. I just wanted to challenge the almost consensus that is arising that sharing doesn't contribute to production, but only to consumption. I think that's not true. I mean, there's two ways of adding 1,000 bed nights. You can either build, say, 4 250 bed hotels, or you could have 1,000 people offering their spare room, and that is an increase in production. Similarly, we have more taxis on the street because of Uber and things like that, and it isn't. We don't need there to be a big business behind something for an increase in production or increase in GDP.
I think the panelists maybe clarified that there's lots of different types of crowd. Crowd platforms. Uber and Airbnb, I think maybe they've got a little bit of negative press, maybe because of some tax avoidance. But there's lots of different types of crowd sharing sites, such as ones which pay membership. So they're traditionally good for the economy. But what's also interesting is the sites which are skill sharing. So there's lots of platforms that actually encourage the sharing of skills and education. And I think they're probably the most, maybe, the greatest for our economy, and that they're helping train people.
Hi there, just sort of contending that it's only the poor people who do participate in the sharing economy. I don't know if you've heard of One Fine Stay, a sharing site known as Airbnb for the 1%, is doing very, very well, and lots of people with amazing homes want to rent them out and share them. Not me, unfortunately.
Does that include luxury yachts as well?
It does actually.
It could be an area to diversify into. And also, just talking about money playing a part in the sharing economy. Yes, technology's playing a big role in growth, but I think also the ability to make money from it is a great incentive for participation. So what role does that play?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly say that maybe we cannot say that the sharing economy is changing capitalism as we know it, but I think that we cannot deny that it is changing the world as we know it. So every day on the news, there's a debate about Uber somewhere in the world, where people are fighting in the streets with taxi drivers, and then this requires a lot of thinking for the governments about how they are going to regulate these new consumer actions. So I guess that it is changing the world, and we have to acknowledge it. And also, I would like to point out the importance of analyzing these types of problems and social changes also from the view of non-developed countries. For example, in my country, 55% of the people have informal jobs and they don't have social security, but they are not working as vendors in the street, but now they are driving a car for someone's car that was otherwise parked. So I guess that these are gains that we have to see from other parts of the world as well.
Hi, I'm just interested in the panel's view on what role government should play in the sharing economy. I think Eva revealed an interesting attitude when she wondered what role the state should play in my taxi fare. Well, obviously, it's the state that provides the roads that my cab driver makes his profession from. Businesses tend to love open source because they're making profits and they get something for free, but they hate government regulation. So I was just wondering what the panel thought government regulation would play in the sharing economy, because at the end of the day, you can crash a car in 1 out of 10 trips instead of 4.5 star rating.
Thank you. So thanks for all your points and questions. So I'm just going to ask the panel to wrap up. So they've got 1 minute each, which is no easy job. So starting with Rob.
I think you'll find, by the way, that there are some people who've made a lot of money out of open source technology. It isn't just some communist thing that goes on in the background of technology. I think the Uber comes up all the time, and I think that's interesting too, because actually there are not that many examples of how this sharing thing has really disrupted existing services and certainly not production. You know, I think Uber is outstanding in that sense, and that what they basically have done is what the road haulage industry did years ago, which is basically fill the car there and back. Right? That's really what they've done. If all we're saying is there are more taxis, that doesn't make it more productive. Right? In fact, you might end up with it being much less productive as a kind of a service or business or whatever. But I think the last point I want to make, and it goes back really to what I was saying at the beginning, which is, and I think it's come up with a lot of the kind of background discussion, the kind of, the sense that this is really about the fact that we don't have any real confidence or belief or even desire to grow our economy any further. Right? We don't really want to either make capitalism work better or find an alternative. What we really are saying is it's all screwed. And we're pretty much stuck, and we just have to make the best of it. All right, well, no thanks. That's not the world I want to be in. Neither do I want to be in a permanent car boot sale of my skills and my possessions. That is not a future that I want to subscribe to.
Lesley.
To the gentleman who's talking about adding 1,000 bed nights, I mean, that is just more consumption. Sorry, in economic terms, that is not more production. I don't believe it is the breakdown of capitalism as we know it. And it's not a labour revolution either. It's just a different kind of freelance work. And there is a serious question here about labour standards and also, as I think I've explained, about consumer protection. But there is another question, which is about how you both regulate and promote innovation. Because even though I've played the big bad wolf who hates the sharing economy, I don't. I think there are lots of fantastic things about it. But I think there are a lot of real concerns about it too. And the question is, how do you regulate it? And I don't think at the moment our government's got any idea about that, even if it does produce independent reports about it. So that's my worry. How do you regulate it? Because it is so diverse and difficult to get at and foggy and very slightly shadowy. And I also worry about how you can democratise the platforms that are big, bloody businesses. I'm sorry, but if you can get cooperatives to do what they do, then I'm all for it.
Well, in response to the state involvement, I think one thing which we're only just beginning to understand, that internet has been based really on the wonderful invention of Tim Berners-Lee, but it's also an invention that means monopolies. So client-server architecture unchecked means everybody in the single database, everybody in the single Uber pot, everybody in the single AirBnB pot, and that's unfortunately how Tim dreamt it up, because in his days, everybody had a server under his desk. So it was unthinkable at that point that it would become only one server. And we have to now use the state while we're figuring out how to decentralize and how to do a better technology that does not end up with total centralization. I think we need the state to insert time to think and break them up. We really should be looking at regulating Google, Facebook, Uber, the lot, into the same way like we regulate media, like we regulate Sky. You know, we would never let Sky take everything. So we have to really start pushing into breaking up all these companies now.
Okay, there are two things that we can't change in this world. One is that we live on a planet of finite resources, and the second is that we have a growing population. And what a sharing economy is doing and does do, it says that we need to share in order to survive and build ourselves a sustainable future. That's what the sharing economy is doing. That's what sharing means. It means sharing those resources, finding different ways, innovative ways that businesses can and organisations can access and share resources to create a more equal, happier, healthier society. That's really what the sharing economy is about. It's about real sharing, true sharing, heartfelt sharing, changing the world as we know it, yes, changing capitalism as we know it, and building a better world. That's why I'm such a passionate proponent of the sharing economy, and I hope that you have heard something today that maybe you haven't heard before, and actually go away and look at some of these incredible resources and find out more about the sharing economy, because we are seeing some amazing examples of how the sharing economy is changing the world as we know it, and of course it needs to.